Welcome to Collab Conversations with the American Diabetes Association and Beyond Type 1. I'm Ginger Vieira, and today we're talking to Dr. Marlon Pragnell, who is the Vice President of Research and Science at the American Diabetes Association. Hi, Dr. Pragnell. Thank you.
Hello, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
And we're going to be really picking your brain today about the genetics of type 2 diabetes and if it runs in someone's family. I would love to just start right off the bat with, is type 2 diabetes considered a genetic or hereditary disease? Are those the same thing?
Yeah, it's genetic. There's there's a strong kind of an inheritable component to it. That's why, for example, when you take the diabetes risk test, one of the questions are, do you have family members with type 2 diabetes? Right. So yeah, there is a strong genetic component. But at the same time, it's not something that because you have a genetic risk for diabetes type 2 that you're going to get it. Okay. There are many ways in which you can avoid that.
I often hear that from people with family members who have type 2 and they feel doomed. They say, well, my mom had it, my grandma had it, so I'm definitely going to get it. And that's not the case, right? Could you tell me just how much could someone reduce their risk of type 2?
Yeah. So we've been doing a lot of research in genetic risk of type 2 diabetes, and I think there's a lot to be learned there. I mean, we do know there's a risk. There are kind of genetic components that can predispose a person to type 2 diabetes. But as we know, it's not all just genetics. Environment plays a huge part in type 2 diabetes. And so even though you may get a score saying, hey, you're at risk, and you also have family members or so, there's so much you can do to really reduce that risk dramatically.
And it's kind of hard to look back too at how environment played a factor in those family members developing type 2, right?
Yeah, there's a kind of a theory there out that the communities that lived in environments that are resource constrained, where there was maybe not all the excess that we have today in terms of, all the hyper nutritious foods and so on, fast foods and so on. We live in a very different environment than what we were originally intended to live in, compared with many hundreds of thousands of years ago. And so our bodies aren't made up for that. So we're actually being exposed to very unusual levels of sugar, kind of processed carbohydrate, processed foods and so on. And that's actually what's driving a lot of it. I mean, you talk about genetics. I mean, genetics is really important. I mean, I think that genetics is going to help us in the future understand maybe the different types of diabetes, for example. In type 2, there are multiple kind of versions. It may also help us understand ways in which you could see what a person's trajectory might be with diabetes, like risk for kidney complications, for example, or risk for eye disease. Maybe it might help us too to decide, genetics might help us say, will a person benefit from one kind of therapy versus another? So will this drug work better in that person? So help kind of drive clinical decisions.
Okay, so the research has pinpointed a few very specific type 2 related genes, right? That are when we think of disease like cystic fibrosis is like one or two mutations, for example. Diabetes is not like that. Type 2 diabetes consists of multiple different small kind of factors, kind of influences, and so we're still not quite there yet in fully understanding what those are. That's why the best way to kind of really say if you're at risk of diabetes, looking at your family history. Is inherited, right? But there are ways, there are like genetic risk scores and so on you can use to kind of get a sense of where you're at. But many things, many aspects around prediction of whether you'll develop diabetes are more clinical, weight, if you're live a sedentary life, primarily sedentary, looking at your clinical measurements, for example, are probably more informative. The one way you can really dramatically improve your risk of not having diabetes, not developing diabetes, is through diet and exercise. It's absolutely it's amazing how and all the research now is coming out that to show this is the case, you know, that you can be predisposed to it, your family can have it, you could be at high risk for diabetes, but if you work towards reducing body weight, if you're kind of a little bit heavy, you know, if you not getting that much exercise, if you start working on kind of increasing your exercise, that will dramatically improve your risk of not developing diabetes.
Okay.
Really important. I can't emphasize that enough.
Right.
You know, so kind of all this kind of concern. If you're a person that has diabetes in the family, if you have a genetic risk score that suggests you're heading that direction, there's so much you can do to stop that from happening, or at least reduce the risk of that happening.
And where does beta cell dysfunction come into play with lifestyle habits? Beta cell dysfunction, for anybody watching, is beta cells produce insulin, and in type 2, they've pinpointed that many people with type 2, maybe a certain percentage, it's like roughly half, I think.
Yeah, a large number. If we're talking about type 2 diabetes, what happens is that with beta cell dysfunction, you know, you develop this kind of insulin resistance in the body. You know, it's different from type 1 diabetes where you don't produce insulin. What happens is that you produce insulin in type 2 diabetes, but the body really can't use it that well. So the glucose kind of just gets stuck outside the cell, stays in the circulation. The blood kind of accumulates the sugar, gets kind of sweet, so to speak. And that's the main thing. So what happens then is that because the body tries to kind of help the insulin go into the tissues through using insulin, the body's going to say, well, okay, let me try harder. So the first thing that the beta cells do is kind of really start cranking out that insulin, and cranking it out and just kind of pushing, because, you know, if something's not happening, you try harder, right? So the beta cells try harder to the point where they start to wear out. And then they kind of stop working, and then actually start kind of get to the point where almost you're at a situation where instead of all this insulin that you're putting out to try and get the body to kind of respond because of the reduced sensitivity, now you don't have any insulin to deliver, and then you have to start taking insulin for that. So,
okay. Wow.
So, yeah.
So beta cell dysfunction is more of a process than just one thing is not working well.
Yeah. The key thing there, though, is this can happen very early on in disease. So, for example, you know, you can spend many, many years not knowing you have this propensity, and that's where you can really have the most impact in preventing diabetes. That early stage.
Right.
So that's why it's so important to kind of, if you're in a family that has you know, increased risk for diabetes, you totally need to understand, you know, that you potentially have at these very early stages that are very invisible, undetectable, where your beta cells are starting to now become a little bit less effective, starting to work harder, right? That first stage of becoming fatigued.
Right, and that's not the stage that really rattles people, because it doesn't come with this firm, alarming diagnosis.
No.
So if it does run in your family, don't wait for the diagnosis to tell you, oh yes, you were at risk, right?
Yeah. And you know what they say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It's so important. What you can do now to prevent diabetes, if you are at that very beginning stages, it's so much easier to prevent and delay than it is later on in the stages. I mean, at every stage you can do something to prevent progress, prevent progression of complications and so on. But the earliest possible stages are the absolutely best place to start. And if you have family members that have diabetes, then you're at risk. You're at genetic risk, and that's the way you need to start at the very earliest stage. Healthy lifestyle, healthy activities.
And it doesn't take much. As a type 1, I can tell you that if I recently didn't do any of my intense cardio jogging for almost a whole week, and my insulin needs, I needed to increase them by 5% just from 1 week of less exercise. And it's amazing how just starting to do my daily jog again, how quickly my insulin needs go back down. So it doesn't take hours and hours. You don't have to go to CrossFit, even just walking 30 minutes twice a day.
Yeah, totally. If you have family members that have diabetes, if you know in your family that your priority right now should be just really getting that bit of exercise. It doesn't have to be like a super, like a super athlete, but just small changes. small changes also in diet as well, kind of skipping those sugary drinks and so on, maybe eating a bit healthier. That's huge, huge impact. Habits, you know, changing habits can really dramatically change lives and really kind of take people on a trajectory to health and not disease.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Pragnell.
Great, thank you.